Meet Mark Thompson, a struggling single dad who works as a maintenance technician to support his teenage daughter. Every night after his shift ends, he retreats to his small shed where he's been secretly working on something extraordinary, a pair of custom-designed prosthetic hands. They're not for him, they're for Sarah Martinez, a compassionate nurse who lost her hands saving others from a devastating hospital fire. Using his mechanical skills and spare parts, Mark is determined to help her return to the job she loves. But when Sarah receives this life-changing gift, she makes a decision that will transform both their lives forever. What happens when one act of kindness sparks an unexpected chain of miracles? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient coffee maker sputtered to life at 5:45 a.m., its familiar gurgle echoing through the modest two-bedroom apartment. Mark Thompson's weathered hands methodically packed Emma's lunch while he waited for the brew, his movements precise. Despite the early hour, 15 years of single parenthood had honed his morning routine to clockwork efficiency. "Dad, have you seen my calculus textbook?" Emma's voice carried from down the hall, still thick with sleep. At 15, she was already taller than him, with her mother's dark curls and his determination. "Check under your physics homework," he called back, adding an extra apple to her lunch bag. She'd been staying up later studying, and he worried about her pushing herself too hard. The acceptance letter from Stanford's engineering summer program lay unopened on the kitchen counter, a reminder of dreams that felt just out of reach on a maintenance technician's salary. The community center, where Mark worked, was already bustling when he arrived at 7. He loved these early morning hours before the usual chaos of basketball practices and senior yoga classes filled the halls. His tool belt settled familiarly around his waist as he reviewed the day's maintenance requests. Stuck window in the computer lab, flickering lights in the east corridor, broken handle on the pool door. It was during these quiet moments that he first noticed her. Sarah Martinez moved through the center like a ghost of her former self, her empty sleeves neatly pinned, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She volunteered 3 mornings a week, helping with the senior wellness program despite her own challenges. Mark had overheard the other volunteers talking about her story, the hospital fire, the children she'd saved, the price she'd paid for her heroism. Today, she was attempting to help Mrs. Chen with her blood pressure reading, awkwardly, manipulating the cuff with her forearms. Mark paused in his work on the nearby drinking fountain, watching as she struggled to secure the Velcro strap. Mrs. Chen patted Sarah's arm gently, her weathered face creased with concern. "Let me help you, dear," the elderly woman offered. "But—" Sarah shook her head. "I need to figure this out," she insisted, her voice carrying the same quiet determination Mark recognized in himself. "There has to be a way." The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of repairs and maintenance checks. During his lunch break, Mark retreated to the small workshop he'd set up in an unused storage room, a perk of being the one person who could fix anything in the building. Here, surrounded by spare parts and tools, he'd begun sketching his ideas. The preliminary designs were crude, but each iteration brought him closer to something functional. He thought about Emma's college fund, about the hours he spent at his second job doing repairs for neighbors, about the Stanford summer program that seemed impossibly expensive. But then he looked at his sketches of the prosthetic hands, and something inside him knew this project mattered more than money. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows as Mark finished installing new hinges on the pool door. Sarah passed by, heading toward the exit, her purse clutched awkwardly between her arms. She dropped her keys, and before she could maneuver to retrieve them, Mark was there. "Allow me," he said, handing them to her. Up close, he could see the faint scars that traced up her forearms, legacy of her desperate rescue attempt. "Thank you," she replied, managing a small smile. "You're always around when things need fixing." "It's my job," Mark said, then added softly, "Some things are harder to fix than others." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, recognition perhaps, or shared understanding. But before either could speak again, his radio crackled with another maintenance request, and the moment passed. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Mark sat in his makeshift workshop, adding detailed notes to his designs. He thought about Sarah's determined attempts to continue helping others, about Emma's dreams of engineering school, about his own yearning to create something meaningful. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by tools and possibilities, he made a decision. He would find a way to help, not just for Sarah, but for himself, for Emma, for the chance to prove that one person's dedication could make a difference. The pediatric ward had always been Sarah's favorite place in St. Michael's Hospital. Even now, 6 months after the fire, she could close her eyes and see the cheerful murals of jungle animals that had lined the walls, hear the soft beeping of monitors mixing with children's laughter. The night everything changed had started like any other. She'd been doing her final rounds, checking on 7-year-old Tommy Rodriguez, who'd been admitted with pneumonia. The boy had finally fallen asleep after a long evening of fever and coughing. The smoke alarm's shriek had torn through the quiet like a knife. Sarah still remembered every detail with crushing clarity, the acrid smell seeping under the door, the way the handle burned her palm when she first touched it. The fire had started 2 floors below, but it was moving fast, too fast. The evacuation protocol she'd practiced dozens of times kicked in automatically. "Everyone who can walk, line up at the door," she'd called, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her chest. "Bigger kids, help the little ones." Tommy was still too weak to walk. Sarah scooped him up, directing the other children toward the emergency stairwell. As they made their way down, she could hear the fire's hungry roar growing louder. The heat was becoming unbearable. They were almost clear when she heard it. A small voice crying from the floor above. Without hesitation, Sarah had handed Tommy to Jerry, one of the older patients. "Get them outside," she'd ordered. "I'll be right behind you." The next few minutes existed in her memory like fragments of a nightmare. The scorching heat as she fought her way back up the stairs. 2 4-year-old twins huddled in a supply closet where they'd hidden in fear. The ceiling collapsing behind them as she shepherded them toward safety. The final desperate push through flames that seemed to reach for them with malicious intent. Her hands had protected the children's faces from the worst of the heat, but the price had been steep. By the time emergency responders reached them, the damage was done. 3rd-degree burns, the doctors had said. Multiple surgeries followed. In the end, they couldn't save her hands. The newspaper article about her heroism still hung in the community. Center's lobby, though Sarah wished they'd take it down. Local nurse sacrifices hands to save children. The headline made her sound like some kind of saint, when really she'd just done what anyone would have done. What she couldn't do anymore was what mattered. Start IVs, change bandages, hold a frightened child's hand during a blood draw. These thoughts circled through Sarah's mind as she sat in her small apartment, watching the sunset paint the walls orange. Too much like flames. The twins' parents had visited her in the hospital, crying, grateful. They'd started a GoFundMe for her medical expenses, but no amount of money could restore what she'd lost. The hospital had offered her an administrative position, but the thought of sitting at a desk away from patient care made her chest tight with grief. The community center volunteering had been her therapist's suggestion. "Start small," Dr. Patterson had said. "Find ways to still help people." So Sarah did, though. Each day felt like learning to walk again. Simple tasks, taking blood pressure readings, helping with exercise classes, filing paperwork, became mountains to climb. She'd noticed Mark Thompson watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. There was no pity in his gaze, unlike so many others, just quiet observation and something else she couldn't quite name. Understanding, perhaps. She'd seen him working late in that small workshop of his, caught glimpses of technical drawings and mechanical parts through her door. Today, when he'd helped her with her keys, she'd felt a spark of something she thought she'd lost. Hope, maybe, or possibility. His words about fixing things had stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she went through her evening routine, awkwardly preparing a microwave dinner, struggling with buttons and zippers. In her dreams that night, Sarah's hands were whole again. She was back in the pediatric ward, checking vitals, smoothing fevered brows, writing in charts. But when she looked down at her restored hands, they weren't made of flesh and bone, but something else entirely. Something stronger, something that couldn't burn. The clock on Mark's workshop wall showed 11:42 p.m., but he barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the components spread across his workbench. Servo motors salvaged from old printers, microcontrollers bought second-hand, finger joints he'd designed and 3D printed at the local library. A half-empty cup of coffee had gone cold beside his notebook, its pages dense with calculations and sketches. He flexed the prototype finger joint, watching the smooth articulation with critical eyes. This was his third iteration, each version getting closer to what he envisioned. The first had been too rigid, the second too fragile, but this one had promise. "Dad?" Mark started, nearly dropping the delicate mechanism. Emma stood in the doorway, wearing her mother's old Carnegie Mellon sweatshirt as pajamas. Her hair was mussed from sleep, her expression caught between concern and curiosity. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up? It's almost midnight." "I could ask you the same thing." She crossed the room, peering at his work. Her eyes widened as she took in the scattered components, the detailed technical drawings, the half-assembled prosthetic finger. Are you building a hand?" Mark set down his tools, suddenly aware of how this might look. A maintenance man trying to play biomedical engineer in his spare time. "It's probably crazy," he admitted, "but you've seen Sarah at the center, how she struggles with the simplest tasks. I keep thinking, with the right design." Emma picked up one of his sketches, studying it with the same intensity she brought to her advanced placement physics homework. "These servo calculations, you're trying to replicate natural finger movement. That's the idea. Each finger needs 3 degrees of freedom, like a real hand. The challenge is making it responsive enough to handle delicate tasks while keeping it strong enough for daily use." He smiled slightly. "I've been watching YouTube videos on biomechanics between repair jobs." Instead of the skepticism he'd feared, Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Dad, this is incredible. Have you considered using magnetic sensors for the control interface? We just studied Hall effect sensors in physics class. They could provide more precise movement detection." For the next hour, father and daughter hunched over the workbench together, bouncing ideas back and forth. Emma's fresh perspective helped him see new possibilities in the design. Her suggestion about the sensor placement could solve the responsiveness issues he'd been struggling with for weeks. "You know," Emma said, sketching a quick diagram, "if we position the battery pack here instead of here, it would better balance the weight distribution." She paused, looking up at him. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Mark ran a hand through his graying hair. "I guess I wasn't sure I could actually do it. I'm not a real engineer, Emma. I fix broken pipes and air conditioners. This is way beyond my usual scope." "But that's exactly why you can do it," Emma insisted. "You understand how things work, how to fix them when they break. Plus," she added with a grin, "you've got a future Stanford engineering student to help you now." Mark's heart squeezed. "About that, sweetie, the summer program. I've been looking at our finances and—" "Dad, stop!" Emma's voice was firm. "We'll figure it out. Maybe I can get a scholarship or do some tutoring for extra money. This," she gestured at the prosthetic components, "this is more important right now. Nothing's more important than your future." "Maybe they're connected." Emma picked up the prototype finger, turning it thoughtfully in her hands. "You always tell me that engineering is about solving problems to help people. Isn't that exactly what you're doing here?" Mark looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just his little girl, but a young woman with her mother's compassion and her own brilliant mind. When had that happened? They worked for another hour, refining the design, making lists of needed components. Emma's enthusiasm was contagious, her quick mind catching details he'd missed. By the time she finally headed back to bed, yawning but excited, the project felt less like an impossible dream and more like a real possibility. Alone again in his workshop, Mark added Emma's suggestions to his notebooks. The Hall effect sensors would need to be specially ordered, but he could get started on modifying the finger joint design tomorrow. His gaze fell on the framed photo on his workbench. His late wife Susan in her graduation gown, proudly holding up her engineering degree. She would have loved seeing Emma like this, he thought. Would have been right there with them, adding her own brilliant ideas to the mix. "I wish you could see her, Sus," he whispered to the photo. "She's so much like you." Outside, the city had grown quiet, but in Mark's workshop, possibilities continued to unfold, one careful calculation at a time. Sarah stared at the coffee cup sitting on the community center's break room counter, mentally rehearsing the sequence of movements she'd need to manage it. She'd modified this particular cup herself, adding textured grip tape around the middle, where she could clasp it between her forearms. Still, hot liquids remained a daily challenge. "Let me help you with that," offered Linda from reception, already reaching for the cup. "I've got it," Sarah said, perhaps too sharply. She softened her tone. "But thank you. I need to practice." Linda withdrew, concern etched on her face. Sarah had memorized that expression over the past 6 months, the subtle mixture of pity and discomfort that seemed to follow her everywhere. She focused on the cup instead, carefully maneuvering it between her arms. Small victories, her therapist called these moments. Today, the coffee made it to her lips without spilling. The morning senior wellness check-ins were getting easier at least. She'd developed a system for the blood pressure cuff, using her teeth to hold one end while positioning it with her arms. Not exactly conventional nursing technique, but it worked. "Usually, your pressure's looking much better, Mr. Rodriguez," she told the elderly man seated before her. He was Tommy's grandfather, the boy she'd carried from the fire. The family had practically adopted her since then, though their kindness sometimes felt like another weight to carry. "Thanks to you, Mihija," he replied, patting her arm. "My daughter wanted me to invite you to Tommy's birthday party next month. He asks about you." Sarah managed a smile even as her chest tightened. "Tell him I said hello." She was gathering her supplies when she heard the familiar sound of Mark Thompson's tools in the hallway. He was replacing a light fixture, his movements precise and practiced. Their eyes met briefly as she passed, and she noticed again how he looked at her, not with pity, but with something like professional assessment. The moment was interrupted by a crash from the exercise room. Sarah hurried in to find Mrs. Chen on the floor, beside an overturned chair, clutching her ankle. "I lost my balance," the older woman explained, trying to wave off concern. "Just give me a minute." Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in immediately, but frustration followed just as quickly. She couldn't help Mrs. Chen up, couldn't check her ankle for swelling or injury, couldn't even offer a steadying hand. "I'll get help," she said, turning toward the door, only to find Mark already there, tool belt still around his waist. "Allow me," he said quietly, moving past her to assist Mrs. Chen. His hands were gentle as he helped her to a seated position, competent as he examined her ankle. "Nothing seems broken, but you'll want to ice this." Sarah watched him work, recognizing the careful efficiency in his movements. He handled the situation exactly as she would have, if she still could. Something about his capable hands made her own absence feel sharper. "The first aid kit's in the supply closet," she said, needing to contribute something. "Left shelf, eye level." Mark nodded, retrieving it without comment. Together, they got Mrs. Chen settled with an ice pack and called her daughter for a ride home. Throughout the process, Mark seamlessly followed Sarah's medical guidance while compensating for her physical limitations. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just quiet cooperation. "You've done this before," Sarah observed after Mrs. Chen had been safely collected by her family. Basic first aid was part of my military training, he replied, cleaning up the supplies. Though nothing like your nursing experience. Former nursing experience, she corrected, the words bitter on her tongue. Mark paused in his work, turning to face her fully. You're still a nurse, he said firmly. The knowledge, the instincts, that's not in your hands. It's in here. He tapped his temple. And here. His hand moved to his heart. The simple truth of his words caught her off guard. For the first time in months, someone was seeing past what she'd lost to what remained. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I should get back to my rounds, she said quickly, needing space to process this new perspective. Sarah? Mark called as she reached the door. You forgot your coffee cup. He held it out, waiting patiently as she maneuvered it between her arms. No offering to help, no rushing to prevent a potential spill. Just quiet respect for her independence. Thank you, she said softly, meaning far more than the cup. Mark stood in his workshop doorway, watching Sarah help with the senior morning check-ins. His prototype sat heavy in his drawer, wrapped in a clean shop towel. Emma's voice echoed in his mind. Dad, you have to show her. The worst she can say is no. He'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, his carefully prepared speech felt inadequate. How do you tell someone you've been secretly building them prosthetic hands? The last senior citizen wandered off, leaving Sarah alone with her paperwork. She had developed an impressive system for managing forms, using her forearms to hold things. In place, while writing, with a pen gripped between her teeth. Mark watched her determination with a familiar ache in his chest. Sarah. His voice came out rougher than intended. Do you have a minute? She looked up, surprised by his formal tone. Of course. Not here, he said quickly. In my workshop? If that's okay. Something flickered across her face, curiosity mixed with caution. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Mark's workshop was unusually tidy today, thanks to Emma's insistence on making it presentable. His technical drawings were carefully organized, his tools arranged with precision. The prototype waited, in its drawer like a secret about to be revealed. I've been working on something, he began, then stopped, started again. First, I want you to know that if this isn't something you're interested in, I completely understand. There's no pressure, no obligation. Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Mark, what's going on? Instead of answering immediately, he opened the drawer and removed the wrapped prototype. His hands were steady as he set it on the workbench, but his heart hammered against his ribs. For the past few months I've been... He unwrapped the towel, revealing the carefully crafted prosthetic hand. I've been working on this. Sarah's sharp intake of breath filled the small room. She stared at the device, its metallic fingers, gleaming under the workshop lights, its joints articulated with precise care. It's not finished, Mark continued quickly, fighting the urge to cover it back up. The response time needs work, and the grip strength isn't quite where I want it. But the basic mechanics are sound. Emma, my daughter, she helped with some of the sensor calculations. You built this? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. For me? I know it's presumptuous. I should have asked first, but I wanted to make sure it was viable before getting. Your hope's up. It's designed to be controlled by muscle movements in your forearm, using magnetic sensors. The fingers can be calibrated for different grip strengths, so you could handle everything from a coffee cup to a blood pressure cuff. Sarah moved closer to the workbench, her eyes fixed on the prototype. How did you learn to do this? YouTube, initially, he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. Then, engineering textbooks from the library. Emma's been teaching me what she learns in her advanced physics class. It's been educational. Why? The question was soft but intense. Mark met her gaze steadily. Because every time I see you, help someone despite your limitations, it reminds me that some people don't just accept the hand they're dealt. They find a way to reshuffle the deck. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. I can't afford something like this. The insurance company barely covered my basic medical bills. I'm not selling it, Mark said firmly. I'm offering to help, to try at least. If you're willing to be patient with the learning curve, I'm willing to keep refining the design until it works for you. Sarah looked from the prototype to Mark and back again. Can I? She gestured toward the prosthetic with her forearm. Of course. Mark carefully lifted the device, explaining its features as Sarah examined it. The control interface would attach here, reading the electrical signals from your muscle movements. Each finger can be individually articulated, and there's a thumb opposition mechanism that allows for different grip patterns. Like for holding a pen? The hope in her voice made his chest tight. Or a stethoscope? He nodded. Whatever you need. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I need to think about this. It's a lot to take in. Take all the time you need, Mark assured her. The offer stands. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Mark, thank you. Not just for this, but for seeing me as someone worth investing in. After she left, Mark sat at his workbench, looking at the prototype that represented countless hours of work and hope. It wasn't perfect yet, but then again, neither was life. Sometimes the most important step was simply beginning. The first fitting session took place on a Sunday morning, when the community center was closed, except for Mark's maintenance duties. Emma had insisted on being there, her notebook ready to record every observation. Sarah sat nervously at the workbench while Mark made final adjustments to the sensor placement. The electrodes need good contact with your skin, Mark explained, carefully positioning the sensors along Sarah's forearm. These will read the electrical signals from your muscle movements. It might take some practice to get the control patterns right. Sarah nodded, trying to hide her trembling. She'd spent the past week alternating between hope and terror, between dreams of holding a stethoscope again and nightmares of failure. What should I expect? Start with something simple, Emma suggested, her enthusiasm infectious. Maybe just trying to move one finger? Mark powered up the system, watching the diagnostic lights blink to life. Focus on your index finger first. Try to think about moving it, just like you would your natural hand. Sarah closed her eyes, concentrating. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a whir so soft it was barely audible, the prosthetic's index finger twitched. Oh, Sarah's eyes flew open, tears immediately welling up. I felt that. I didn't feel it, but I made it move. Mark and Emma exchanged excited glances. Try again, Mark encouraged. This time, keep your eyes open. Watch the movement. The second attempt was less successful. The finger jerked erratically, then locked up. Sarah's face fell, but Mark was already reaching for his tools. That's normal, he assured her. The calibration needs fine-tuning. Emma, can you note down the sensor readings? They worked through the morning, adjusting sensitivity levels, repositioning sensors, testing different muscle groups. Each small success was celebrated, each failure analyzed and documented. By noon, Sarah could reliably move 3 fingers, though coordinating them remained a challenge. It's like learning to walk again, she said during a break, watching Mark make modifications to the thumb joint. My brain knows what it wants to do, but getting there is complicated. Neural pathways, Emma chimed in, looking up from her notes. We studied this in biology. Your brain needs to create new connections for controlling the prosthetic. It's like learning to play an instrument. Speaking of instruments, Mark said, finishing his adjustment, try this. He placed a plastic cup on the table. Let's see if we can work on a grasping motion. Sarah positioned herself, focusing intently on the cup. The prosthetic hand moved slowly, fingers extending toward the target. The first attempt knocked the cup over. The second barely brushed it. But on the third try, her fingers closed around it, not gracefully but definitively. I'm holding it, she whispered, then louder. I'm holding it. The cup slipped a moment later, but it didn't matter. The possibility had become real. They continued testing throughout the afternoon. Each attempt taught them something new. The thumb needed more rotational freedom. The wrist joint was too stiff. The sensor placement had to be precisely mapped to prevent signal interference. "Dad," Emma said quietly during another adjustment, "what about the Stanford program? The deadline's tomorrow." Mark glanced at Sarah, who was practicing finger movements with fierce concentration. "We'll figure something out," he murmured back. But Sarah had heard. "Stanford program?" Emma explained about the engineering summer program, her acceptance, and the looming deadline. Sarah listened intently, her eyes moving between father and daughter. "How much is the tuition?" she asked. "It's not important right now," Mark insisted. But Emma answered anyway. $5,000. Sarah looked at the prosthetic hand, then at her own scarred forearms. "That's a lot of money to spend on someone else's hands, instead of your daughter's future." "It's not instead of," Mark said firmly. "This project, it's teaching both of us more than any summer program could. Right, Emma?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "The practical applications of electromagnetic sensors alone are fascinating. Plus, I'm learning about neuromuscular interfaces, mechanical engineering, even basic programming." "Still," Sarah interrupted, "it's not right. You should try the cup again," Mark said, effectively ending the discussion. "I've adjusted the grip sensitivity." This time, when Sarah grasped the cup, she managed to lift it an inch off the table before it slipped. Progress measured in inches and ounces, but progress nonetheless. As they packed up for the day, Sarah caught Mark's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for treating it like a project we're all working on together, not something you're doing for me." Mark squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's exactly what it is. A journey we're all taking, one step at a time." Walking home, that evening Emma linked her arm through her father's. "You know what, Dad? I think we're building something even bigger than hands here." Looking at his daughter's knowing smile, Mark couldn't help but agree. Mark sat at his kitchen table late that night, surrounded by bills and bank statements. The numbers refused to add up differently, no matter how many times he rearranged them. The Stanford program's deadline glared at him from Emma's acceptance. A letter, while receipts for prosthetic components scattered across the table told their own story of mounting expenses. His cell phone buzzed. Another text from the evening maintenance job he'd had to cancel to work on Sarah's prototype. That was $300 he couldn't afford to lose, but the calibration sessions couldn't wait. The servo motors alone had cost nearly 2 weeks' worth of overtime pay. "Dad?" Emma stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of tea. She'd started doing this lately, bringing him tea when she found him up late working on bills. Too much like her mother, knowing too much too young. "You should be in bed, sweetheart. So should you." She set a mug in front of him and peered at the papers. "Is it about Stanford?" Before he could answer, an envelope slid from the stack. The latest statement from his second mortgage, taken out for Emma's college prep courses. The interest rate was crushing, but it had seemed worth it when she got the highest SAT scores in her school's history. "I'm not going to Stanford," Emma said quietly. "I already decided." Mark's head snapped up. "What do you mean you're not going?" "I can do the regular summer session at the community college instead. Mrs. Peterson says they might even have a teaching assistant position available in the physics lab. That would look good on my college applications too." "Emma, no, we're not giving up on Stanford. I'll figure something out." "Dad," her voice was gentle but firm, "I've seen the component receipts. I know how much you're spending on Sarah's hands, and it matters more. Nothing matters more than your future." "This is my future." Emma sat down, pushing aside some bills to spread out her notebook. "Look at these designs. The sensor array we developed, it's completely original. The grip strength calibration system, that's innovation, Dad. Real-world engineering that's actually helping someone." Before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sarah. Insurance denied the appeal again, still claiming experimental technology isn't covered. I'm so sorry. Emma read the message over his shoulder and squeezed his arm. See? We can't stop now. She needs this. Across town, Sarah sat in her own apartment, staring at the insurance company's final denial letter. Her savings account was almost depleted from the previous surgeries and rehabilitation. The small disability payment barely covered her rent, and her parents had already remortgaged their house to help with her medical bills. She flexed her forearms, feeling the phantom sensation of fingers that weren't there, the memory of holding. That plastic cup, even for a few seconds, haunted her. For the first time in months, she'd felt like a nurse again, not just a former nurse. Her gaze fell on the newspaper clipping framed on her wall. The story about the hospital fire. The article mentioned that the twins she'd saved had made full recoveries. Their parents had offered to help with her expenses, but she'd refused. They had their own children to take care of. A notification popped up on her laptop. Another rejection. From a grant application for medical assistance technology. She'd applied to every foundation she could find, but they all said the same thing. Individual cases weren't eligible for funding. Back in Mark's kitchen, father and daughter were still discussing options. What if we started a GoFundMe? Emma suggested. People love inspiring stories. Mark shook his head. Sarah would never agree. She already feels guilty about the Stanford situation. Then we don't tell her. We focus on the bigger picture, developing affordable prosthetics for everyone. That would take more resources than we have, Emma. The prototype alone is already working better than the $50,000 model the insurance company denied her. Emma's eyes lit up with that familiar problem-solving gleam. Dad, what if that's the real opportunity here? Not just helping Sarah, but finding a way to make this technology accessible to everyone who needs it. Mark looked at his daughter, seeing again that mixture of her mother's compassion and her own brilliant mind. Then he looked at the bills scattered across the table, each one a reminder of the gap between dreams and reality. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from the community center director, budget cuts coming, all non-essential staff hours being reduced. Need to discuss your schedule tomorrow. Mark closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all these intersecting pressures. When he opened them, Emma was still watching him, waiting for his response, believing in him with that absolute faith that both inspired and terrified him. One step at a time, he said finally, echoing his words to Sarah. First, we get the prototype working perfectly, then we'll see what other possibilities open up. The workshop hummed with nervous energy early Saturday morning. Emma had spent the entire week refining the sensor algorithms, working through lunch periods and staying up late into the night. Mark had rebuilt the thumb mechanism 3 times, each version more responsive than the last. Today would be their first attempt at fine motor control. Ready? Mark asked, making the final connections to the control interface. Sarah nodded, trying to keep her breathing steady. The previous sessions had shown promising progress with gross motor movements, but today was different. Today they would attempt something she hadn't done in 6 months. Write her name. Remember, Emma said, adjusting her laptop where she was. Monitoring the sensor feeds, just like we practiced. Visualize each movement before you make it. Mark placed a pen and paper on the workbench. The pen looked impossibly small, impossibly precise in its requirements. Sarah stared at it, remembering thousands of patient charts, prescriptions, care notes. Her name, written countless times throughout her nursing career, now seemed like an insurmountable challenge. I don't know if I can, she whispered. You can, Emma said firmly. The calibration is perfect. The grip sensitivity is exactly where it needs to be. Trust the science. Trust yourself, Mark added quietly. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on the muscle patterns they'd been practicing. The prosthetic hand moved smoothly, fingers extending toward the pen. The first attempt to grasp it failed. Too much pressure. The pen skittering across the workbench. That's okay, Mark encouraged, retrieving it. The sensors are reading clearly. Try again, just a little lighter touch. The second attempt was better. The fingers closed around the pen with surprising delicacy. Sarah held her breath, carefully lifting it off the surface. The pen stayed firmly in her grasp. Perfect, Emma breathed, watching the sensor readings. Now for the hard part. Sarah positioned the pen over the paper, her arm trembling slightly. The first mark was messy, more scrawl than script. The second try produced a wobbly S. Wait, Mark said suddenly. He moved behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. You're too tense. Remember, the prosthetic responds to muscle signals. The more stressed you are, the more noise in the system. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension ease under his steady touch. She thought about all the times she'd signed her name without thinking. Patient admissions, medication orders, birthday cards to her colleagues. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath months of loss and adaptation. The third attempt flowed more naturally. Her hand moved across the paper with growing confidence, the letters taking shape. Sarah Martinez, RN. For a moment, no one spoke. They all stared at the signature, not perfect but unmistakably hers. You did it, Emma whispered, breaking the silence. Dad, look at the sensor readings. They're exactly what we predicted. But Mark wasn't looking at the readings. He was watching Sarah, who hadn't taken her eyes off her signature. A tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink slightly. I can write again, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can actually write. Encouraged by this success, they spent the next hour testing different tasks. Sarah managed to pick up paper clips, turn pages in a book, even type a few words on Emma's laptop. Each achievement was meticulously documented, each failure analyzed for future improvement. The thumb opposition still needs work, Mark noted, making adjustments after. Sarah struggled with a twisting motion. But the basic functionality is solid. Emma, your sensor modifications made all the difference. The real breakthrough was your new grip mechanism, Dad, Emma replied, still monitoring the data streams. The response curve is incredible. Their technical discussion was interrupted by a small sound from Sarah. They turned to find her holding something new, a stethoscope she'd brought with her, hope warring with fear on her face. Do you think... She couldn't finish the question. Mark nodded encouragingly. Try it. With painstaking care, Sarah positioned the stethoscope in her prosthetic hand. The earpieces took several attempts to place correctly, but then... I can hear my heartbeat, she whispered, wonder and tears mingling in her voice. For the first time since the fire, I can actually use a stethoscope. Emma was rapidly typing notes, but her own eyes were suspiciously bright. Mark stood quietly, watching Sarah listen to her own heart, seeing in her face the same joy he felt in his chest. A knock at the workshop door startled them all. The community center director stood there, eyebrows raised at the scene before her. I came to discuss the budget cuts, she said slowly, her eyes fixed on Sarah's prosthetic hand still holding the stethoscope. But it seems I'm interrupting something far more interesting. Sarah quickly moved to remove the stethoscope, but the director held up her hand. No, don't stop. In fact, she pulled out her phone. I think it's time we showed the board exactly what kind of innovation is happening in our maintenance department. The video of Sarah using her prosthetic hand had gone quietly viral within the medical community. 3 days after the director's impromptu filming session, Sarah sat in Mark's workshop, scrolling through emails on her tablet. Another inquiry from a prosthetics company, she said, looking up. They want to know if we're interested in selling the patent rights. Mark barely glanced up from the calibration he was performing. That's the third one this week, right? Fourth. Sarah set down the tablet. Mark, we need to talk about this. Really talk about it. He finally looked up, recognizing the tone in her voice. Emma, who had been updating their documentation, closed her laptop. I've been doing research, Sarah continued. Did you know the average cost of a medical-grade prosthetic hand is between $40,000 and $50,000? And that's not including fitting and training. Most insurance won't cover experimental designs, Mark added, thinking of Sarah's denied claims. Exactly. But what we've created here, she flexed her prosthetic fingers, the movement now nearly as natural as breathing. We did it for less than 5,000 in parts. Even with labor costs and overhead, we could produce these at a fraction of the market price. Emma leaned forward. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Sarah pulled a folder from her bag, actual paper, because she'd wanted them, to see how easily she could now handle documents. I've drawn up a preliminary business plan. My savings aren't much, but they're enough to lease a small workshop space. With my medical background and your engineering expertise. Sarah, Mark interrupted gently, I'm a maintenance technician. I'm not qualified to what? To innovate? To solve problems no one else has solved? She gestured at her working hand. You've already done that. And Emma's sensor modifications are literally years ahead of what's currently on the market. Emma picked up the business plan, her eyes widening as she read. You want to hire Dad full-time? As head of engineering? At first, it would just be the three of us. We'd focus on custom prosthetics, working directly with patients to create affordable solutions. No corporate overhead, no massive markup, just helping people who need it. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture both women now recognized as his processing mode. The liability issues alone are addressed in Section 3, Sarah said, reaching for the folder and flipping it open with her prosthetic hand, a deliberate demonstration. I've already spoken with a medical device lawyer. We'd start with a pilot program, working through existing physical therapy centers, build our reputation gradually. The community center could be our first partnership, Emma added excitedly. Think about it, Dad. All those people you help every day with building maintenance, you could be helping them rebuild their lives instead. Mark stood up, pacing the small workshop. His tools lined the walls. Familiar, comfortable, safe. But lately, they'd felt less like his life's work and more like a limitation he'd placed on himself. The timing, he said finally, with Stanford coming up. About that, Sarah smiled. Page 7. I've structured the initial investment to include an educational development fund. Any employee pursuing relevant education gets tuition assistance, including summer programs, Emma gasped. You do that? It's not charity, Sarah said firmly. It's investment in our future expertise. Besides, she added softly, I wouldn't have these hands if it weren't for both of you. Helping with your education is the least I can do. Mark picked up one of his technical drawings, studying the careful measurements and annotations. He thought. He paused, struggling to articulate the dream he'd never dared to have. I always just fix things. Other people's innovations, other people's designs, and now you can create them, Sarah said. Help people like me rebuild what they've lost, but at a price they can actually afford. We'd need a name, Emma mused, already catching her father's shift toward possibility. Sarah smiled. I was thinking, Second Chances Prosthetics. Too obvious, Emma declared. What about Thompson Martinez Innovations? How about just Helping Hands? Mark suggested quietly. Sarah tested the name silently, watching her prosthetic fingers move. Simple, honest, just like how this all started. Speaking of starts, Emma said, pulling up a spreadsheet on her laptop, we should run some initial cost projections if we factor in bulk purchasing of components. Mark watched his daughter dive into the calculations, saw the light in Sarah's eyes as she leaned in to discuss materials sourcing. The fear was still there, of failure, of inadequacy, of the unknown, but something else was growing stronger. The possibility that maybe fixing things had just been practice for building something entirely new. All right, he said, pulling up a chair. Show me those numbers. The small industrial space didn't look like much, just another unit in a row of identical workshops on the outskirts of town. But to Mark, standing there with the keys in his hand, it represented everything he'd never let himself imagine. Matter, Leases for 2 years, Sarah said, watching him take it all in, with option to expand into the unit next door if we need it. Mark walked the perimeter slowly, his maintenance technician's eye cataloguing every detail. Good bones, decent electrical, ventilation would need work. The previous tenant had been a custom furniture maker, leaving behind sturdy workbenches that could easily be adapted for their needs. "Dad, look!" Emma called from a small office area in the corner. "Perfect space for the design station. We can set up the 3D printer here, keep the assembly area separate from the consultation room." Her voice trailed off as she noticed her father's expression. "What's wrong?" Mark pulled out his resignation letter from the community center, still unopened. After 15 years, he'd written it in careful, measured words, explaining nothing about prosthetics or new ventures. "Just a simple thank you and 2 weeks' notice. You don't have to do this," Sarah said softly, reading his hesitation. "We could start smaller, keep it as a side project, while you maintain your regular job." "No," Mark's voice was firm. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. These people we want to help, they deserve our full commitment." Emma took the letter from his hands and tucked it into her bag. "I'll drop it off on my way to school. Consider it done." They spent the rest of the morning moving in their essential equipment. Mark's tools, carefully accumulated over decades of maintenance work. The 3D printer Emma had won in a science competition. Sarah's medical reference materials and testing. Equipment. Each item found its place, transforming the empty space into something purposeful. "First client consultation is scheduled for Thursday," Sarah announced, using her prosthetic hand to pin up a calendar. The movement was so natural now that Mark had to remind himself how impossible it had seemed just months ago. "Remember that email from the Veterans Hospital? They have a patient they'd like us to meet with." "Already?" Mark's stomach tightened. "Shouldn't we take some time to set up properly, run more tests?" "We've been testing for months," Emma reminded him, unpacking her laptop and development tools. "The prototype works. Sarah's hands work. We have all the documentation and certifications from the Medical Device Review Board. But this would be someone new. Different circumstances, different needs, different opportunities to help," Sarah finished. She flexed her prosthetic fingers, a gesture that had become her way of making a point. "Mark, do you know what I did this morning? I made coffee, drove my car, and typed 3 emails. 6 months ago, I couldn't do any of those things. Now I'm about to become a business owner because you decided to help one person." A knock at the door interrupted them. The community center director stood there holding a small package. "I hoped I'd catch you here," she said, stepping inside. "The board meeting just finished. I thought you should know. We've approved a partnership proposal. If you're interested, we'd like to establish a referral program for community members needing prosthetic services." Mark blinked. "But my resignation is exactly why we want to partner with you." She handed him the package. "You've been fixing our building for 15 years. Now you can help fix our people. The contract details are inside, along with a letter of recommendation for any other community centers you approach." After she left, they stood in stunned silence, looking at the package. "Well," Emma said finally, "I guess we should add partnership agreements to our setup checklist." Sarah was already making notes on her tablet, her prosthetic fingers tapping efficiently on the screen. "We'll need to draft formal assessment protocols, establish pricing tiers for different income levels. One step at a time," Mark said, echoing his old refrain. But this time it didn't feel like caution. It felt like progress. They worked through the afternoon, setting up workstations, organizing inventory, creating client intake forms. Emma configured their design software while Mark installed additional lighting and power outlets. Sarah arranged the consultation area to feel welcoming but professional. As evening approached, they stood together in the center of their workshop, no longer just a dream, but a reality taking shape around them. "We should have a proper nameplate," Emma suggested, "something official." Mark looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Walking to the front window, he carefully applied the vinyl lettering they'd had made, Helping Hands Prosthetics Innovation. "Through understanding, too late to turn back now," he said, half-joking. Sarah stood beside him, her prosthetic hand finding his real one. "No," she said softly, "it's exactly the right time to move forward." Their first client was a 24-year-old veteran named Jason, who'd lost his right hand in Afghanistan. He sat stiffly in their consultation room, his empty sleeve pinned up, skepticism evident in every line of his body. "I've been through this before," he said flatly. 3 different prosthetics. None of them worked well enough to justify the cost. My insurance is maxed out and I can't afford— "Let's not talk about cost yet," Sarah interrupted gently. She held up her prosthetic hand, moving the fingers with fluid precision. "Let's talk about what you need your hand to do." Jason's eyes widened as he watched her movements. "You're a nurse, or I was, before I lost both hands in a fire. Now, I'm part of developing what you see here." She gestured around the workshop. "No corporate markup, no unnecessary bells and whistles, just functional, affordable solutions." Mark observed from his workbench, letting Sarah handle the initial consultation. She had a way of connecting with clients that he couldn't match. The shared understanding of loss, the practical knowledge of rehabilitation. But when Jason began describing the specific tasks he wanted to perform, Mark's mind was already sketching modifications. "The grip strength is crucial," Jason explained. "My last prosthetic couldn't handle basic tools. I used to work construction, but now—" "Dad," Emma whispered from her computer station, "I think the modified thumb joint from Sarah's latest upgrade would work perfectly for this." They were interrupted by a call from their parts supplier. The specialized servo motors they needed were on back order, 6 weeks minimum. "We can't wait that long," Mark muttered after hanging up. "We promised Jason a prototype fitting next month." "What about those salvaged printer motors?" Emma suggested. "The ones you used in my science fair project? Too imprecise. We need medical-grade components." "Not necessarily," Sarah chimed in, having finished with Jason. "The medical-grade servos are over-engineered for most tasks. If we could modify the printer motors—" Mark was already shaking his head. "The liability issues are covered under our testing protocols," Emma finished. "We just need to document the modifications and run extra durability tests." They worked late into the night, Emma writing new calibration software while Mark disassembled and modified motors. Sarah handled the growing stack of paperwork, insurance forms, liability waivers, partnership agreements with physical therapy centers. "The Veterans Hospital called again," she mentioned during a coffee break. "They have 3 more potential clients." Mark looked up from his workbench, worry creasing his forehead. "We can barely handle Jason's project with our current setup." "We need to scale up," Emma said, not looking away from her screen. "The demand is there. We just need to figure out production efficiency." A crash from the storage area made them all jump. A box of components had fallen, scattering expensive parts across the floor. Mark stared at the mess, calculating the cost of each rolled-away sensor. "We can't afford mistakes like that," he said quietly. "Our margins are too thin." Sarah began picking up parts with her prosthetic hand, a task that would have been impossible months ago. "Then we learn from them. Document everything. Create better inventory systems." "I can help with that," came a voice from the door. Jason had returned, a day early for his appointment. "I may not be able to work construction anymore, but I know a thing or two about organizing inventory." They all stared at him. He shrugged. "Look, I know I'm supposed to be just a client, but I've been feeling useless since coming home. If you're really trying to make these things affordable for people like me, I want to help." Mark glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "We can't pay much," he warned. "I don't need much. Just a chance to be part of something that matters." That night, after Jason had helped them reorganize the entire storage system with military precision, Mark sat looking over their revised budget. The numbers were still tight, but something else was growing, a sense of community, of shared purpose. Emma brought him his nightly tea, peering over his shoulder at the spreadsheet. "We're going to need a bigger workshop soon," she observed. "One step at a time," he replied automatically. "Dad," she sat beside him. "Look around. Every step we've taken has led to something bigger than we imagined. Maybe it's time to think bigger." From the start. From her desk, Sarah called out, "The Veterans Hospital is on the phone again. They want to know if we can handle trauma cases." Mark looked at his daughter's eager face, at Sarah's confident smile, at the workshop that already felt too small for their dreams. "Tell them yes," he said. "We'll figure it out." The local news crew arrived just before 9, turning their modest workshop into a maze of cables and lights. Sarah stood before a mirror, using her prosthetic hands to straighten her collar. A deliberate choice, she'd told Mark. People need to see what's possible. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, watching the reporter set up. The story had started small, a feature in the Veterans Hospital newsletter about Jason's success. Then a local medical blog picked it up, focusing on their affordable pricing model. Now Channel 7 wanted to do a human interest piece about the nurse and the maintenance man revolutionizing prosthetic care. "Too late to back out now," Emma said cheerfully, making sure their latest prototypes were properly displayed. She'd insisted on wearing her Stanford Engineering Summer Program t-shirt, proud evidence of how far they'd come. The reporter, Lisa Chen, approached with her notebook. "I understand you started this in a community center workshop," she asked Mark. "What inspired you to take such a leap from maintenance work to medical devices?" Mark glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "fixing things isn't enough. Sometimes you need to rebuild them entirely." The interview flowed more easily than he'd expected. They demonstrated their design process, showed clips of Jason working with inventory, using his new prosthetic hand. Sarah explained their commitment to affordable pricing, while Emma showcased their innovative sensor technology. "And you developed this while still in high school?" Lisa asked Emma, genuine surprise in her voice. "Dad taught me that engineering isn't just about formulas. It's about solving real problems for real people." The camera panned across their client wall, where photos showed their growing success stories. Jason organizing inventory, a pianist, testing a specially calibrated hand, a young mother holding her baby for the first time since a car accident. "This is more than just a business," Sarah explained, demonstrating complex medical procedures with her prosthetic hands. "It's about giving people back their independence, their dignity, their sense of purpose." "And their savings accounts," Jason added from his workstation. "My previous prosthetic cost $45,000. Helping Hands got me back to work for less than a quarter of that." The story aired that evening. Mark watched it with Emma and Sarah in his living room, cringing slightly at seeing himself on screen, but proud of how they came across, not as miracle workers, but as problem solvers making a real difference. His phone buzzed halfway through the broadcast. Then again, and again. "Dad," Emma was checking their business email on her laptop. "We just got 15 new inquiries." "No, 20. They're still coming in." Sarah's phone was ringing too. "The Veterans Hospital. They want to discuss a formal partnership agreement." And there's another call coming in from the University Medical Center. Mark felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of growing responsibility, of others depending on them. But before he could voice his concerns, there was a knock. At the door, it was Mrs. Chen from the community center, leaning on her cane and holding a newspaper clipping about their upcoming TV feature. "I always knew you were fixing more than just buildings," she said, smiling at Mark. "My grandson in Seattle, he lost his hand in an industrial accident last year. Would you be able to help him too?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Seattle was hundreds of miles away. They'd never attempted to help someone remotely. "We'd need to modify our fitting process," Sarah mused, already problem-solving. "Set up video consultations, work with local physical therapists, create standardized measurement protocols," Emma added, typing notes. Maybe develop a preliminary testing kit we could send. Mark looked at Mrs. Chen's hopeful face, remembering all the times she'd brought him tea during late maintenance shifts, how she'd always treated him as more than just the handyman. "We'll figure it out," he promised. Later that night, after Mrs. Chen had left with preliminary paperwork, and Emma had finally stopped checking the ever-growing email inbox, Sarah and Mark sat in the quiet living room. "Everything's going to change now," he said softly. Sarah flexed her prosthetic fingers thoughtfully. "It already has. The question is, are we ready for what comes next? More clients means more resources needed, more space, more materials, more lives we can change," she countered. "Mark, do you remember what you told me when you first showed me the prototype, about not accepting the hand we're dealt?" He nodded, remembering that nervous moment in his workshop. "Well, look at the hand we've built instead." She held up her prosthetic, now so much a part of her that it seemed natural. "Maybe it's time to help others do the same on a bigger scale." Mark's phone buzzed again, another email notification, another person somewhere hoping they could help, another opportunity to make a difference. "One step at a time?" Sarah asked, smiling at his familiar phrase. "One step at a time," he agreed, "but maybe we can take bigger steps now." The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the letterhead of Advancement Medical Technologies. Sarah recognized the name immediately, one of the largest prosthetics manufacturers in the country. Her prosthetic hand trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. "Patent infringement," Mark read over her shoulder, his face paling. "That's impossible. We developed everything from scratch. They're claiming our sensor array design violates 3 of their existing patents." Sarah continued scanning the document, her nursing training helping her maintain composure even as her stomach churned. "They want us to cease operations immediately." Emma, who had been setting up their new testing station, dropped her tools with a clatter. "But their sensors don't even work the same way. Our design is completely original. I have all the development notes to prove it." "They know that," Jason said quietly from his workstation. "This isn't about patents. It's about competition." Mark sat heavily in his chair, the letter crushing beneath his grip. They had 5 active client projects in development, including Mrs. Chen's grandson in Seattle. The Veterans Hospital was counting on them for their new rehabilitation program. "And now this. We need a lawyer," Sarah said decisively. "A good one." "We can't afford a good one," Mark replied. "The materials for Mrs. Chen's grandson's project already stretched our budget to the limit." Emma was furiously typing on her laptop. "Their cheapest prosthetic model costs more than our most expensive one. They're just trying to shut us down because we're making their prices look bad." The phone rang, another potential client calling for help. Sarah let it go to voicemail, her heart heavy. They'd have to suspend taking new clients until this was resolved. "What about the university?" Emma suggested. "My Stanford mentor specializes in medical device patents. Maybe she could—" "No," Mark interrupted. "We're not risking your academic future on this. Dad, this is more important than— Nothing is more important than your future." "This is my future," Emma's voice cracked. "Everything we've built here, this is what I want to do with my life. Help people, solve problems, make a difference." Sarah watched father and daughter face off, seeing in both their expressions the same stubborn determination that had started this whole venture. She looked down at her prosthetic hands, hands that had given her back her life, her purpose, her ability to help others. Hands that now might be denied to others who needed them. "Maybe," she said slowly, "we could negotiate. Offer to license their patents, even though we're not using their designs." "That would drive our costs up," Jason pointed out. "We'd have to raise prices, which defeats the whole purpose," Emma added bitterly. Mark had gone quiet, the kind of quiet Sarah had learned meant his mind was working through a problem from every angle. Finally he spoke. "Show me their patents again." Emma pulled up the patent numbers listed in the letter. They spent the next hour analyzing the technical specifications, comparing them to their own designs. "Look at this," Mark said finally, pointing. to a detail in their sensor array. We're not just using different technology, we're solving a different problem entirely. Their patents focus on precise finger control for delicate tasks, but our breakthrough was the adaptive grip strength. Emma finished, catching on. The way the hand learns from repeated tasks and adjusts automatically. Could that make a difference? Legally? Sarah asked. It might, Jason said thoughtfully. My brother's a paralegal. He always says the key to fighting patent trolls is proving your innovation serves a different purpose. Mark was already reaching for his phone. Remember that. Reporter Lisa Chen. She mentioned her brother works in intellectual property law. Mark, Sarah cautioned. We can't afford— Let me make the call, he insisted. Sometimes people want to help if you give them the chance. Isn't that what we've been proving all along? While Mark spoke with the reporter, Emma pulled up their client files. Look at these results. Jason's grip strength adaptability, the pianist's finger response patterns, Mrs. Chen's grandson's preliminary measurements. We're not just making cheaper versions of existing prosthetics, we're making them better. Sarah felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the same feeling she used to get helping patients recover, watching them grow stronger day by day. So we fight? We fight, Mark confirmed, hanging up the phone. Lisa's brother wants to meet tomorrow. He says our case looks promising, and he's willing to work with us on the fees. Emma was already organizing their development documentation. Jason started pulling success metrics from their client database, and Sarah flexed her prosthetic fingers, remembering her own journey from loss to recovery to purpose. One step at a time? She asked Mark with a slight smile. One step at a time, he agreed. But this time we're not stepping back. The Veterans Hospital conference room was packed beyond capacity. What had started as a small meeting with Lisa Chen's brother, David, had somehow transformed into something much bigger. Mark stood at the back, overwhelmed by the turnout. Their clients were there. Jason in front, proudly demonstrating his prosthetic hands' capabilities to newcomers. The pianist they'd helped sat at a portable keyboard, playing intricate melodies with her modified prosthetic. Parents of children they'd fitted shared before and after videos on their phones. But it wasn't just clients. The community center director had brought her entire board. Physical therapists from 3 different clinics sat together comparing notes. A group of engineering students from the local university huddled around Emma, examining her sensor designs with obvious admiration. Did you arrange all this? Mark whispered to Sarah. She shook her head, equally amazed. Jason made a few calls to his veterans network. Mrs. Chen reached out to her church group. After that, she gestured at the crowd, it just spread. David, Chen stood up, adjusting his tie. As your legal counsel, I've reviewed Advancement Medical's patent claims thoroughly. But before we discuss the technical details, I think we should hear from the community about what helping hands really means. One by one, people stood to speak. A young mother described how her prosthetic hand had allowed her to hold her newborn for the first time. A high school student demonstrated how he could now play video games with his friends. An elderly man showed off his ability to tend his beloved garden again. My grandson in Seattle, Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying clearly despite her age. He was losing hope. The insurance company told him good prosthetics were out of reach. Now? She held up her phone, showing a video of a young man confidently handling tools in a workshop. Now he's reopening his furniture business. The physical therapists presented data showing improved patient outcomes and reduced recovery times. The university students shared an analysis of how helping hands innovations were advancing the entire field of prosthetic design. This isn't just about cheaper prosthetics, the Veterans Hospital director added. This is about accessibility, about dignity, about giving people back their independence without bankrupting them. Mark felt Emma slip her hand into his. She'd been quiet throughout the meeting, but he could feel her trembling with emotion. David stood again. Based on everything I've seen, Helping Hand's design philosophy and implementation are fundamentally different from Advancement Medical's patents. You're not just making prosthetics more affordable, you're approaching the entire problem from a new angle. The adaptive grip strength technology alone, one of the engineering professors interjected, represents a significant innovation. And the user-specific calibration protocols are unprecedented in the field, which is exactly why they're trying to shut us down, Jason said, standing. But here's what they didn't count on. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. Every veteran in this room has signed a petition to the VA Medical Board. We're demanding they investigate discriminatory pricing practices in the prosthetics industry. Sarah gasped softly beside Mark. The VA was one of Advancement Medical's biggest clients. Additionally, the community center director added, "Our board has approved an emergency grant to help with legal expenses. It's not much, but..." "And our clinic network," one of the physical therapists stood. "We've documented every case where patients were denied adequate care due to prosthetic costs. The data is compelling." The university's engineering department, Emma's Stanford mentor, spoke up, "is prepared to provide expert testimony about the unique nature of your innovations. Pro bono, of course." Mark looked around the room, seeing in every face the same determination he'd felt that first night in his workshop. These weren't just clients or supporters, they were partners in something bigger than he'd ever imagined. "There's more," Jason said, pulling up a web page on the projector. "Remember that video from the news story? It went viral in the prosthetics community. We started a GoFundMe for legal expenses last night. Take a look." The number on the screen made Mark's knees weak. Donations had poured in from around the country, many accompanied by stories of struggles with overpriced prosthetics or insurance. "Denials, this isn't just about us anymore," Sarah said quietly, her prosthetic hand steady as she pointed to the comment section. "Look at what people are saying. Don't give up. We need you. Keep fighting." David gathered his papers, smiling. "I hope this answers your question about whether we can afford to fight back. Now, let's talk strategy. Because based on what I've seen today, we're not just defending against their claims, we're going to change the entire industry." As the meeting shifted into detailed planning, Mark felt something he hadn't experienced since starting this journey. Absolute certainty. They weren't just a small workshop anymore, they were a movement. "One step at a time," Emma asked, grinning at her father's overwhelmed expression. "One step at a time," he agreed, but with a lot more people walking beside us now. The Medical Innovation Conference Hall buzzed with activity, but Mark couldn't take his eyes off Emma. His daughter stood confidently before a panel of experts, explaining the adaptive grip strength technology as if she'd been doing it her whole life, which, he realized with a start, she practically had. From those first late nights in his workshop to her now completed Stanford summer program. The key breakthrough, Emma was saying, manipulating a demonstration model, wasn't just making it cheaper. It was recognizing that each person's needs are unique. Traditional prosthetics try to replicate a standardized hand. We created a system that learns and adapts to how each individual actually uses it. In the audience, Sarah sat with perfect posture, her own prosthetic hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd insisted on wearing her old nursing uniform for the presentation, the conference badge reading, "Sarah Martinez, RN, Chief Medical Officer, Helping Hands Prosthetics." "Remarkable," one of the panelists said, examining the technical specifications. "And you developed this while still in high school?" "With my father," Emma corrected firmly. "He's the one who first realized we needed to approach the problem differently." She caught Mark's eye and smiled. Sometimes the best innovations come from seeing old problems with new eyes. The questions that followed were technical, probing, professional. Emma handled them all with grace, but always brought the focus back to their core mission, making quality prosthetics accessible to everyone who needed them. "The patent challenge from Advancement Medical," another panelist asked, How has that affected your development process? Actually, Emma's grin widened, it helped us prove how unique our approach is. Our legal team demonstrated that our technology represents a fundamental shift in prosthetic design philosophy. The case was dismissed last week. A murmur ran through the audience. The dismissal was too recent to have made the news, but its implications were clear. David Chen had done more than defend them. He'd established their innovation as legitimately groundbreaking. And your pricing model? The question came from a hospital administrator in the front row. How can you maintain quality while charging so much less? Sarah stood up smoothly. May I address that? At Emma's nod, she made her way to the podium, every movement with her prosthetic hands deliberate and precise. I'm not just an executive at Helping Hands. I'm also a client. These hands, she held them up, they cost less than a quarter of what my insurance-approved models would have cost. And they work better. She demonstrated a series of complex medical procedures, taking a pulse, handling delicate instruments, even writing in a patient chart. We don't cut corners. We cut out unnecessary complexity. We design for real needs, not profit margins. The next hour passed in a blur of technical discussions and practical demonstrations. Jason, now their production manager, explained their streamlined manufacturing process. The Veterans Hospital director presented their outcomes data. Even Mrs. Chen's grandson joined by video link from Seattle, showing how he'd adapted his furniture-making techniques with his prosthetic hand. After the formal presentation, a representative from the National Institute of Health approached their group. We've been following your work with great interest, she said, handing Mark an official-looking envelope. The accessibility guidelines for medical prosthetics are coming up for review. We'd like Helping Hands to be part of the advisory committee. Mark stared at the invitation, remembering late nights fixing leaky pipes and flickering lights. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Dad, Emma interrupted gently. You're more than qualified. You're necessary. The NIH representative nodded. Your practical approach to innovation is exactly what we need. Too many advances in medical technology never reach the people who need them most. You've shown there's another way. Later, at the small celebration dinner they held in their hotel, Sarah raised her glass with her prosthetic hand, a gesture that had become smooth and natural over the months. To Emma's brilliant presentation, to Dad's brilliant innovation, Emma countered, to all of us, Jason added, and to everyone still waiting for their second chance. Mark looked around the table, at his daughter, now accepted into Stanford's engineering program with a full scholarship, at Sarah, who had found a way to help people again, at Jason, who had built a new purpose for himself. The NIH invitation sat in his pocket, heavy with possibility. You know what this means, Sarah said softly. We're going to need a bigger workshop. Again, and more staff, Jason added. The waiting list keeps growing. One step at a time, Emma teased, using her father's old phrase. Mark smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that first tentative design in his community center workshop. One step at a time, he agreed, but now we know where we're going. The new Helping Hands facility was everything their first workshop wasn't. Spacious, modern, properly equipped. But Mark had insisted on keeping one thing, the original workbench where he'd first designed Sarah's prosthetic hands. It sat in his office now, its scarred surface a reminder of where they'd started. He stood at that workbench, making minute adjustments to their latest prototype, when Sarah found him. Even without looking up, he knew it was her from the distinctive sound of her prosthetic hands on the doorframe, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The board meeting's about to start, she said softly, though I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say about the expansion proposal. Mark straightened, setting down his tools. We've barely gotten settled here. Adding 3 new production facilities would help clear our 6-month waiting list. Sarah moved closer, examining his work on the prototype. Besides, Emma's research team has the production process nearly automated. We could maintain quality control even with multiple locations. The mention of Emma brought a proud smile to his face. His daughter had insisted on spending her summer internship at Helping Hands rather than taking more prestigious offers. "The future of engineering is here," she'd declared. "Why would I go anywhere else?" "Have you looked at the numbers Jason prepared?" Sarah asked, perching on the edge of the workbench, a casual intimacy that had developed naturally over their months of collaboration. "I have." Mark ran a hand through his increasingly grey hair. "The financing works. The logistics make sense. It's just what?" He gestured around the workshop. "This all started because I wanted to help one person, to fix one problem. Now we're talking about facilities in 3 states, research partnerships, medical board advisory positions." Sarah's prosthetic hand found his, the touch so natural now that neither of them remarked on it. "And every single step has been about helping people. That hasn't changed." Before he could respond, Emma burst into the office, her Stanford engineering jacket barely concealing her professional attire. "Dad, the test results from the pediatric prototype just came in. The neural interface modifications worked perfectly." Her excitement was contagious, and Mark found himself grinning despite his concerns. The pediatric project had been Emma's idea, developing prosthetics that could adjust as children grew, saving families from buying new ones every few years. "Also," Emma added, her tone turning sly, "I picked up something from the jeweler on my way in." She pulled a small box from her bag, handing it to her father with a meaningful look. Sarah pretended not to notice, but Mark could feel her hand tense slightly in his. The ring had been Emma's idea too, or rather, she'd been the one to finally make him admit what everyone else had seen developing between him and Sarah over the past year. "The board meeting," Sarah reminded them, starting to stand. "Wait." Mark's voice was soft but firm. He kept hold of her hand, reaching for the box with his other. "I had a whole speech planned, about how you inspired me to be more than I thought I could be, about how watching you overcome every obstacle made me believe anything was possible." Emma quietly backed toward the door, but neither of them noticed. "Mark," Sarah began, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. I was going to save this for somewhere more romantic than my office, but this workbench is where everything started, where I first dared to think I could help you, where you first trusted me enough to try." He opened the box, revealing a ring elegantly designed to work with Sarah's prosthetic hands. "I'm not just asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to keep building this dream with me, to keep showing people that limitations are just problems waiting to be solved, to keep reminding me that sometimes the best way to fix something is to reimagine it entirely." Sarah looked at the ring, then at the workbench where her life had changed, then at the man who had changed it. "You know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for someone who claims he's not good with words, that was quite a speech. Is that a yes?" She answered by pulling him close with both prosthetic hands, hands that had become so much a part of her that neither of them thought of them as anything but natural. "One step at a time, remember?" "Speaking of steps," Emma called from the doorway, where apparently she hadn't left after all, "the entire board is watching through the glass wall, and I think they're about to start applauding." Sure enough, through the office windows, they could see their extended Helping Hands family. Jason, the production team, the research staff, all the people who had become part of their journey, breaking into cheers and applause. "So," Sarah said with a laugh, "about that expansion proposal." Mark slipped the ring onto her prosthetic finger, marveling at how something so technical could be part of a moment so tender. "Yes to both," he said. "After all, we have more people to help. And now we have even more reason to help them together." 2 years later, the pediatric ward at St. Michael's Hospital looked nothing like Sarah remembered from the night of the fire. The walls had been repainted, the murals replaced, but the spirit of the place remained the same. Only now, she wasn't here as a nurse. She was here as something more. "And you can adjust it as you grow," she explained to 10-year-old Maya. demonstrating the expandable features of the prosthetic arm they'd designed. No more waiting for insurance approval for a new one every year. Maya's eyes widened as she watched Sarah use her own prosthetic hands to make the adjustments. "You have them too?" "I do. And you know what? They let me help even more people than I could before." From the doorway, Mark watched his wife work with their youngest client yet. Maya had been born with a congenital limb difference, and her parents had been told that quality prosthetics were years away, financially out of reach, until they'd heard about Helping Hands. Emma appeared beside him, her Stanford doctoral research badge hanging alongside her Helping Hands ID. "The neural interface readings are perfect," she reported quietly. "The growth adjustment algorithms are responding exactly as designed." Mark nodded, pride swelling in his chest. The pediatric prosthetics program had become Emma's specialty, combining innovative engineering with her natural ability to connect with young patients. She'd even started teaching a course at the university, Accessible Innovation, Engineering for Real-World Impact. "Remember when fixing a leaky pipe seemed like a big challenge?" he whispered to his daughter. Emma smiled, watching Sarah help Maya grasp a pencil for the first time. "You were never just fixing things, Dad. You were learning how to rebuild lives. You just didn't know it yet." The hospital's chief of surgery appeared in the doorway, accompanied by two familiar faces. The twins Sarah had saved from the fire, now in their first year of medical school. "We heard Helping Hands was here today," one of them said, stepping forward. "We wanted to thank you, all of you, what you've built. It's inspiring our research into burn treatment and rehabilitation." Sarah stood, professional but touched. "Sometimes good things grow from difficult moments," she said, her prosthetic hand finding marks instinctively. The chief of surgery cleared his throat. "That's actually why we asked you here today, beyond helping Maya." He gestured for them to follow him to a nearby corridor where a small crowd had gathered. There, on the wall, was a newly installed plaque, the Helping Hands Pediatric Prosthetics Center, where innovation meets compassion. Below it, a photo showed their journey, from the first community center workshop to their current multi-state operation. "The hospital board voted unanimously," the chief explained. "We're establishing a permanent partnership. Any child who needs prosthetic care will have access to Helping Hands technology, regardless of their family's financial situation." Jason stepped forward from the crowd. He'd come to support Maya, his first pediatric case, as lead production manager. "We're ready for it. The new automated production system can handle the increased demand, and our training program for technical staff is fully developed. And the research opportunities," Emma added, already thinking ahead, "combining medical data with our adaptive technology." Mark squeezed Sarah's hand, remembering all the late nights, the challenges, the moments of doubt. "One step at a time," he whispered their old phrase. Sarah smiled, using her free hand to help Maya sign her name on the guest book, the first signature with her new prosthetic. "Look at her, Mark. Every step led us here, and there are still so many more people to help." Later that evening, they gathered in Mark's original workshop, which they'd preserved within their expanding facility. Emma was explaining their latest innovations to Mrs. Chen, whose grandson had recently opened his second furniture studio. Jason was training new production staff, his prosthetic hand moving with practiced ease as he demonstrated calibration techniques. Sarah found Mark at his old workbench, tinkering with what looked like a new prototype. "Still fixing things?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Still making them better," he corrected, showing her his design. "It's a simplified version of our hand design, something that could be produced locally in developing countries using available materials." "Always thinking bigger," she said proudly. "I learned that from you, from all of this." He turned to face her. "You know, when I first started designing your hands, I thought I was just solving a problem. I never imagined that you were building a future." Emma joined them, carrying Maya's final test results. That's the thing about helping people, Dad. It has a way of growing beyond what you can imagine. Through the workshop windows, they could see their expanded facility, humming with activity even at this late hour. Engineers, technicians, and medical professionals worked side by side, all focused on the same mission, making sure that no one had to accept limitations that could be overcome. "So," Sarah said, picking up a small tool with her prosthetic hand, a movement so natural now that it seemed impossible to remember when it had been just a dream, "what shall we build next?" Mark looked